That's okay. I do want to thank David very much for offering to give these classes. There's always been interest in different things, but it's always a balance of trying to find the right interest, the right people, the right time. And David has volunteered to say, I'll take the risk of will people come or not. So I do appreciate it. It's a lot of effort into preparing these classes. So thank you, David. And I hope that the effort at engaging more with tefillah should be not only to our benefit all the time, but in particular, I should say it the other way, in particular as we're leading into Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, but it should also carry forth for our tefillah all the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Before you go, Rabbi, first of all, I want to say Baruch HaMaboyim. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to Rabbi Billet for encouraging the idea of doing these types of classes, and for creating an atmosphere in the community that welcomes the growth of Torah. So thank you, Rabbi. I also want to thank Jeff Benko for helping, for publicizing, for Linda Diamond for making sure the schedule was clear. I want to thank Mindel because this took a number of hours to prepare, you can imagine, and she was very willing to give up her time.
But I didn't have to type it. No, I did not type it.
Right, she didn't do any typing, that's for sure. And thank you to all of you for appearing in person, or if you're watching this online, for devoting some of the time of your day to learning together with me. So, to start off, what is prayer anyway, and what is the effect of prayer on our lives? So I'm going to read you something. This is a quote from Rav Kook, and he says, "Ha'hevdel bein mi shemispalel mi she'ein mispalel." What is the difference between people who do pray and people who don't pray? So, "Einenu b'zeh she'arishon miyached shah b'yom tfilaso." It's not that the first one sets aside an hour, or he has an hour during his day that he prays. "Vasheni einenu miyached shah zu l'shem zeh," and the other one who does not engage in prayer doesn't set aside the time for that. "Yesh kan hedel ikar." There is a basic difference. "Ofen chayehem shel sheni elashona legamri." The lifestyle of the second one is totally different. Is that something I need? Thank you.
You gotta
Is
ask.
it working?
Okay, so we'll start it over again.
It's so loud.
The difference basically between someone who prays and someone who does not pray, it's not that the first one sets aside time in the day and that's the time he has for inspiration and the other does not. He said, "Ofen chayim shel shnei sheni," the lifestyle of the second person is totally different. Osa shor shel tefillah, that hour spent in prayer, mabia chosam miyuchad al kol hayom kulo, leaves a unique imprint, says Rav Kook, on your entire day. So people who spend their time of their day engaged in prayer, it infuses the entire day, says Rav Kook. So when we take a look at these psukim, the first one is from the prophet Hosea, and the second one is from the Sefer Devarim. Henry Grantham Guinness, who was a Protestant preacher, an Irish Protestant preacher at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, and he said that prophecy is history written in advance. Hosea Hanavi, the prophet Hosea, he was active a few decades before the fall of the northern kingdom, Malchus Yisrael. And he was giving, most of his book is admonition, warnings, castigation to people. Towards the end now, he said this famous quote, "Neshama parim swasenu." What does that mean? He said that we will replace the animal sacrifice with the service of our lips. And when you think about it, that's really what's happened. But is that all there is, really? Is our prayer simply replacement for the animal sacrifice that we no longer do? Or is it also, this is a quote from Devarim, which we just read, from the Kriya Shema. It says, to serve Hashem with all of your heart. So Rashi says, what is service of the heart? He's Ezahu he says, Ezer avoda shebalev, what is the service of the heart? He says, that is prayer. And so we have two different views in a sense. What is prayer actually? Is it replacing what we no longer have, the service in the temple, or is it something unique and something special for itself? So we can take a look at history, we can take a look at the development of prayer, and there's a running debate among many scholars, and my wife included, over whether Yiddishkeit, the Jewish religion, changes over time, it evolves over time. What actually happens? And very interestingly, we just learned this last couple of days that there still are Jews in the world who own slaves. Very surprising, right? These Jews emigrated from Ethiopia. Some of them brought their slaves along with them to Eretz Israel, and they continue in that position of servitude. It's sort of an open secret. I see some of your open mouths. It's a surprise. So we talk about a lot of things in the Gemara that we discussed. The temple sacrifice. We also talk about rules applying to slaves, and that still actually exists to this day. Early prayer, as mentioned in the Torah, is, you can see some of the examples there. It's basically personal, it's informal, it's in a way one-sided, because what is it? Yaakov is asking Hashem to protect him along the way, right? And we have the one with Shimshon where he's dying of thirst. He just killed 1,000 Philistines and he's thirsty. He's asking for water. And that type of thing, it's transactional, it's one-sided, it's personal, and it's not something that's organized. And that continues, that type of prayer continues along the entire biblical period. At the end of that time period, when the prophecy was beginning to fade out, this is around the Second Temple period, we had the group known as Anshe Knesset Hakdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. There were 120 of them, and they sealed the Tanakh. In other words, if Phil Shue were to write a book right now, it would not get included into Tanakh. That's over. That's not happening. It's been sealed. But they also put together a lot of the prayers and the brachos. So they composed the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei that we say every day, and a lot of the brachos that we say every day. So, and then from that point onward, you had the first time that public reading of the Torah was done during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's one of the examples that you have in there in your biblical list. The Talmudic period is when the most growth took place, because it's interesting that what was going on in the world, what was going on in the Jewish world after the fall of the Second Temple, really after the fall of the First Temple, when the Babylonian exile took place. Prior to that, there's really not a lot of evidence that synagogues existed in any large number in Eretz Israel before the first century of the Common Era, right? When we take our tours, we see the old synagogues and the mosaics on the floor. Those almost always are post the beginning of the first century, second century of the Common Era, because before that, the temple was central. Even though for most people it was a very uncommon occurrence to go there, there are 3 prescribed pilgrimage holidays, festivals, where people did go or they didn't go, but certainly it was difficult for wives to go, children to go, and it was a far distance. So most people, certainly for most of the year, were not going into a situation with organized religious observance. But once the temple was destroyed, so now comes into play what Hosea is saying. And it's very interesting because he's prophesying before the first temple was destroyed, and yet what is he saying? He's not saying that after all this destruction takes place, that the temple will be rebuilt and that sacrifices, animal sacrifices will start again. But no, he's saying that we're going to have the lip service, the prayer that we're going to be doing. So he's not saying what's going to be restored. So the question is that something that we are looking forward to? Is it going to be coming back? You know, we say it, we ask for it every day, but are we really expecting that the temple service is going to be coming back? or is Jewish observance similar to what we're doing right now, every day in our own lives? Is that what's going to be happening in the future? So when the second temple, you have, if you take a look, your first source where it's the Mishnaic one, it's from the Mishnah in the Masechta Tamid, where it discusses the prayer in the temple itself. Right, where he says what the Kohanim did. It says, Amar lehem ha'mamuneh, that the appointed one, the leader, he would say, Baruch Hu bracha achas, he would say one blessing, Ve'hein Baruch Hu, and then they would repeat afterwards. Then he says Asara, Dibros, and so on and so on. So there was a certain amount of organization at that point in the temple where the Kohanim would gather daily and they would repeat certain things, but that's really about it, what we know that actually took place. So the question also is, when the offerings were brought, were there prayers that were said along with them? So we know that when the Bikurim were brought, the first fruits were brought, so there was a whole declaration that was said, a whole ceremony. But generally speaking, when somebody offered a sacrifice, was there prayer that goes along with it? Not necessarily. We don't really know that. We have no record of what it was. So whether it happened or it didn't happen, we don't really know. But once the temple was destroyed, now what was going to be the central aspect of observance of the Jewish religion? It had to be done by you and me, by us. We had to do it. We had to create it. And that creation was the organized synagogue and organized prayer. And what was also happening at the same time was the oral law, right? We know that at Sinai 2 Torahs were given, right? We were given the written law, Torah Shebiksav, and Torah Shebal Peh, the oral law. The oral law is what we know now as the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the Gemara. And that was meant to be given and transmitted orally, not to be written down. But after the dispersion and all the wars and so on, and the exile, then the oral law became written, right? So what we have, what we study daily, is the Talmud was actually written down. And just as the need for the Torah, the oral law, to be written down, so too was there a need for organized prayer. And that was developing just about the same time. That was happening at the same time as the Gemara was being created, so too were the prayers. So the Gemara does mention many different mentions, and you see them in your sources, where who organized the Shemona Esrei and so on. So there was something going on, and that was happening throughout this period. So when there were communal prayers, you have the situation with the Choni story. That's your source number 18. Famous story where there's a drought in the land, and the only people didn't know what to do, and they called on Choni HaMa'agel, and he drew a circle on the ground and he prayed for rain. And it's an interesting story, but that was when people would get together to pray, was when there were national emergencies. So in terms of daily prayer, the Ikar, the main part of our prayer, what we actually call tefillah, is the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei. And that was composed either before or after the destruction, and that was written by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Torah study was considered an act of devotion too. So where we say, L'avdo b'chol lavavchem, so that's also the Torah study, not necessarily prayer. And certain discoveries have been made. The Qumran scrolls, what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Recently, I'd say the last 100, 150 years, the Cairo Geniza. Maybe you've heard about that. That there was a synagogue in Cairo where for hundreds of years people put their shemos. We have a little box here for shemos, but there was a room actually, people would throw it over the top, and all sorts of material wound up being there. And anything was written in Hebrew, so somebody hired a contractor, and it was a Jewish person hiring a Jewish contractor, and they wrote out the agreement in Hebrew. That wound up in the Cairo Geniza. And there was a lot of poetry, a lot of piyutim, things that we never knew that these things actually existed because they never made it into the formal siddur, but that's in there. And this is something we've discovered really since about late 1800s, early 1900s, and of course the one person who's most responsible for spreading the information about the Cairo Geniza was Solomon Schechter. And he worked on that when he was at Oxford in England. Then when he came to the United States as head of the Jewish Theological Seminary, that work continued in Europe. So before the destruction of the temple, Yerushalayim was central. That was the main thing. But after that, when that could no longer take place, it was in a certain sense, and it was a liberation in a way, because now the religion had to spread. Before that, you had a place, you had the temple and the service in the temple, but who really owned that in a sense? Who participated in that? Mostly it was Kohanim, and even among the Kohanim, it was divided up, right? They was divided into 24 different groups of Kohanim. Each one served for a week, right? Here we have a Kohen Gadol Harmon. So that's the point. It was not for everyone. It was for, and among the Kohanim, once you did it once, you didn't go back, right? That you had one opportunity at it. So it wasn't the kind of thing that has become a democratic spread of the Jewish religion, and that happened after the destruction of the temple. So now what became the locus, what became the focus of the Jewish religion in daily life? That became the synagogue. And in order to have an organized and coherent observance in the synagogue, we needed a book. You know, the Gabbaim here make an issue of when people are saying Kaddish, and Michael, you know this is true, they want everybody to come up front and say it slowly, say it together, so that people will understand what's going on. And can you imagine people getting together and not having an organized list of prayers, not having a book? So the Siddur had to come into play. And the first Siddurim appeared somewhere around 8th or 9th century. And that's when this really took off. This happened after the first destruction. The first Siddur was called Rav Amram, Seder Rav Amram. That was about 850 of the Common Era. He was one of the group called the Gaonim. And then came the one by Rav Saadia Gaon in the 10th century, and many, many different Siddurim throughout the years, whether they were written by the Sephardim, the Kabbalists, and others. And up until today, there's still new Siddurim coming out all the time. In fact, a little later, I'll be quoting from Mrs. Rookie Billet, happens to be the rabbi's mother, and she wrote a very beautiful essay in the new Siddur Avodah Alev, which was published in 2018. And she talks about the need for kavanah, for intent on prayer, and she has a very good little summary about what prayer means to women, what prayer is to women, whether women should be participating in it. So then, after came the Siddurim of the Gaonim, then you had the Rishonim, the Achronim, and now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what is it that requires us to pray. And what I'm going to be using, this book is called Tzurba Merabanan. It is a compilation. It actually was started in Eretz Yisrael, continues there. Originally, this was written in Hebrew. Now it's being made available to the general public in English, and I think some other languages too. And there are groups meeting around the world like this, thousands of them actually, that take this book, because what it does, it'll take a particular topic and it will start with the Torah source and go into the Talmudic and Rishonim, Achronim, very concise fashion. So we're going to be talking about the source for the obligation of tefillah, right? What is it? So first of all, what does the Rambam have to say about prayer? So the Rambam is saying that prayer is not just a substitute for the temple service. He says that prayer is a Torah obligation, and he also says that women are obligated in prayer. Interestingly, we'll get to that in a little while. But in the Gemara in Tainus, actually in the Mishnah of Tainus, it says, La'avos Hashem Elokechem, u'la'odo b'chol levavchem. So this verse we're quoting is actually from Kriya Shema, the 2nd chapter. He's Ezahu Avoda Shebulei. What is service of the heart? Hareza Tefillah. That is prayer. And then the Rambam says, HaMitzvah Chamisha. So the Rambam, created an order. He listed the 613 mitzvos. He said the number 5, he says, Shetzivanu Avdo, that Hashem commanded us to serve him. He says, Nichbal Tzivui Zeh Pa'amim. This is repeated several times. Amar, he says, Avadatem es Hashem Elokechem. You should serve Hashem your God. And he says, Amar Oso Tavodu. You should serve him. Amar, and again he says, Oso Tavodu. So he says it a couple of times. And the idea is that we serve God, we no longer have the ability to do it through animal sacrifice. What we have is service by prayer. And not everybody agreed with the Rambam. The Ramban disagreed with him. He says, Ein haskama b'zeh. I don't really agree. He says, Shekavar be'er chachamim b'Gemara. He says the Gemara explains that what actually took place, Kamosh Amar b'shlishi shel brachos, the third of the bracha of Masechta Brachos, that prayer is something. Ramban said people are inspired to pray when they feel an emergency, and so what the Rambam is saying is the obligation to pray is every day. So Ramban says no, it's when we are troubled and we have a need, so we go to prayer. And so, but in a sense they're saying the same thing, because he says the state of the world is so precarious that we're in an emergency status every day. So Rambam says it one way, the Ramban says it another, but the need and the desire and the obligation to pray is something that exists every day. And he says, what is it to serve God? He says that the service of God that we have available to us is the ability to pray. So further along in the Gemara, it says, Amalei Rav Shemin bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan. So Rav Shemin bar Abba said to Rabbi Yochanan, Mikti, Anshe Knesset Zagedola, Tiknu Lahem Yisrael, Brachos Tefilos Kedoshos. So he said that the Anshe Knesset Zagedola, and this is in your Mishnah and Talmud, it's your source number 6. He says, Shimon HaPakuli, his dear Shmona Esrei, Brachos, with Nei Rabban Gamliel, Al Seder B'Yivana. So he said, B'Yavne, he said that Shimon HaPakuli put it all together. Says Ki miyachad b'meya v'esrim zukenim. So how about the after the 120 elders, the Anshe Knesset Gedola, mehem kama neviim, and among them were some prophets. Tiknu Tefillah al Hesed. They organized it. He says Shimon HaPakuli, my seed. What did he do? He says shekacham v'chazor l'sudarim, that they were forgotten, and he remembered what it was, and he organized it into the system. So the idea was that when we say Shemona Esrei, everybody can say prayers that relate to themselves and also to the general population. So you're always able to formulate your own requests to Hashem in your daily prayer. So what the Rambam is saying further on, he says, Kivin Shagoli Yisrael b'mei Nebuchadnezzar Russia. So when the Jewish people were exiled in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, so they were mixed in with the Greeks and the Persians. So the Jews found themselves in strange places. Their children were born in these places, and guess what? Their kids didn't grow up speaking Hebrew, right? Because they grew up speaking Greek or speaking Farsi or whatever the language was. And everyone's language was mixed, was confused, right? So then the Kivan Shehoya Medaber Eino Yochol Ledaber Kol Tzorcha V'Loshen Achas Ela B'Shibosh, that since the prayers could not be said because it was all confused, so imagine people sitting in a room like this speaking in 20 different languages. How would that actually operate? He says, so what had to happen is that a common book available to everybody, written in Lashon HaKodesh. So when a person wants to make his own request, and he wanted to make his request in the holy language, holy tongue in Hebrew. So he got distracted by hearing the sounds of everyone else. So therefore, it had to be a system created, and that's why we needed to have Sidurim. So the Nefesh HaChaim, this is Rav Chaim of Volozhin. He lived in the 18th into 19th century in Belarus. So he says, Hamaskil Yovin Midato Shelo Lechina Hutzruchu L'Tikun Techina Katana Tefila Katsara. So it's obvious why these prayers had to be created. He said, and among the people who did the organization, some of them were prophets. So it's certainly that they wrote the original prayers, and then along came the Talmud, and they organized it. And in Masechta Brochas further, it says, how do we know? We daven 3 times a day, right? Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. So Avraham Tikkun Tefillah, Shacharis, that Avraham organized Shacharis, the morning prayer, right? Shneimar Vayashkem Avraham Baboker. This is in your biblical one, it's number 12. He says, and he says he got up early, and the place where he stood, Ve'en Amida Ela Tefillah. What is we call our main part of our tefillah? We call it Amida, right? So here he's saying that Abraham stood up. So Amida, that is tefillah. Shnemar Vayamod Pinchas V'Yifalel, and also Pinchas. There's a place where he's mentioned said that he stood up and he prayed before he took the action that he did. He sought inspiration. He wanted to know that he's going to do the right thing. Yitzchak, he came to us Mincha. Yitzchak, Abraham's son, the second of the 3 Avos, he organized the tefillah of Mincha. Shnemar, v'yetze Yitzchak l'suach b'sodeh, that Yitzchak went out to speak in the field. Lefanos Arav, towards the afternoon, before evening. Ve'en sicha el tefillah. And what is conversation really? Certainly in terms of the Avos, it's prayer. It says, Shnemar, tefillah la'ani ki yatev l'fnei Hashem yishpoch sicho. That the poor will pour out his conversation before God, which means he's praying to God. And then Yaakov Tikkun Tefillas Arvis, and Yaakov set up the evening prayer, Shnemar, Vayifgaba Makom Vayolan Sham. He encountered Hashem, and he rested there. Ein Pegia El Tefillah, and this word Pegia, which means encounter, it's only in terms of prayer, Shnemar, V'ato al tispala b'ada amazeh. Do not pray for this nation. Al tisa b'adam rina tefillah al tifka bi. So the word tifka appears where it's talking about prayer. So we do say that originally Ma'ariv was considered a reshus. It was voluntary. It was not obligatory. Shacharis and Mincha were, Ma'ariv was not. And the reason that happened was because of what Hosea said, that we're substituting for the activities in the temple. So in the temple, there was a carbon tamid, right? There was a daily offering, had to be brought every single day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. But there was no obligatory offering in the evening. But it turned out that the temple was busy morning, noon, and night because they burned the remainder of the sacrifice that had been brought all day long, they burned that at night. So there was always activity. Therefore, the rabbis decided that Ma'ariv became something that we were obliged to do as well. So we're actually running out of time. So I want to read to you what Rebbetzin Billet has to say about prayer for women. And if somebody could get me a copy, Michael, there's a sitter back there, the black one, Avodah Halev. It's on the 3rd shelf. No, move over to the right a little bit. One more. 3rd shelf down, left-hand side. That's it. You bring it down to me. Thank you. This is Rebbetzin Billet. In that sitter, in the back of the sitter, there's a whole bunch of essays, some of them very, very good. And she has her comment about prayer and in the intention of prayer. And when it comes to prayer for women, listen to what Yoki Billet has to say. She says, the question of women's obligation to prayer, and we'll get into it in detail next week, I guess, into what it means, what people do, but she says the question of women's obligation to prayer is not do they have or are they exempt. Certainly there are halacha opinions that are leading when it comes to women's obligation to pray, especially when child care or family responsibilities make urgent demands upon her time. The question rather is, why would a woman want to deprive herself of such uplifting opportunities for cultivating a meaningful relationship with the Almighty? Sharing her deepest yearnings with God, encountering the divine in the everyday details of her life, experienced as a woman, a bat Torah, a daughter, a sister, mother, or grandmother, or for that matter, as a communal role model for other women. A woman who wishes to be a full participant in Jewish life will want to take complete advantage of the opportunity to pray at every stage of her life, to address her Creator on a daily basis as a confident but humble human being, fashioned in God's image and blessed with a woman's chachma and special bina, a woman's wisdom and understanding. So this can really apply not just to women, it can apply to all of us. And the hope is that we'll gain a little bit of insight into what's going on in the Siddur in the coming weeks, and maybe it's going to give us a little help when it comes into going to the high holidays. So thank you all for coming, and God willing, we'll continue this fascinating topic next week.